unless we don't. And every once in a while in this series on Romans that we started at the beginning of summer, we've been kind of peppering it with a sermon from the Beatitudes, from the Sermon on the Mount. So today we're going to be looking at the second Beatitude, which is in Matthew 5, which is the Beatitude, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And I know a lot of us have experienced different kinds of loss in our lives. So I encourage you to maybe call to mind some of that loss. It might feel very uncomfortable for you, and that's okay, but this is a safe space for discomfort to belong. The Sermon on the Mount is the most well-known and famous teachings of Jesus while he walked on this earth, and specifically the Beatitudes, which there was, I think, 9 of them. And oftentimes the Beatitudes are like chalked up into this list of things that we're trying to attain somehow, like I'll be a good Christian if I can meet this level, that level, and this level. And that's really not the way it's meant to be. It's not meant to be something that we like try to attain so we can receive God's blessing. The Beatitudes are actually an announcement that no one is excluded from God's love, and God doesn't overlook or forget anybody. That is what the Beatitudes announce. So no one is left out. And some of us have experienced a lot of feeling left out over our lives. We're excluded in some way or another. And the Beatitudes tells us an entirely different story of what God does. And for those listening in to Jesus' message at that time, they would have understood that blessing was only reserved for those who were the most educated, or the most wealthy, the most beautiful, the most wise, those with power. That's where blessing sat. And if you look at blessing, at those who are blessed even in our society today, we think of the blessed ones as the ones who have their lives together in some way or another. People who haven't experienced major loss or major heartbreak in their lives. So for Jesus to begin with his interpretation of God's heart and God's law, with declaring that blessing or happiness or fortune is another way to explain what the word blessing is, that God's heart and law is a fortunate type of people who are typically ignored and forgotten, that would be absolutely intentional on Jesus' place. To be able to say that these people who are often forgotten are the one that God is on the side of. So today's blessing Jesus offers over our lives is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And we think of like, okay, those who are happy and fortunate are those who are mourning. Like, really, Jesus? That feels a little uncomfortable, honestly. That feels really unnerving. That those who have lost something of their greatest value are supposed to feel happy. This is a heavy and pretty impossible perspective for anyone who has lost someone or something that is close to them. Like the mother who lost her child, the husband who lost his wife, the divorce that split homes and hearts in two, the church family that you lost when your beliefs began to shift a little bit and you didn't know what you believed at that point, the illness that keeps taking life away from you, the loss of innocence and trust through physical and sexual abuse. Really, Jesus? Like, happy? Blessed, God's really with me in this. We're a small community, and I know a lot of you in this room. And I know if we tallied the amount of loss that each of us have experienced in this room, it would be quite great. It would fill this space way more than our bodies do. We carry loss in our bodies, we feel it in our bones. It goes from generation to generation sometimes. There's a type of loss in our lives that is not just death, which is absolutely a loss that each of us have experienced or will experience, but there's the loss of health, of partnerships, of our job or career, the loss of time as we get older. It feels like I'm losing out on all these opportunities that are happening and I want to be a part of. There's the loss of abilities and the loss of friendships, of faith, the loss of children, the loss of morals or ethics that we've engaged in sin, and there's a type of grief that comes from that. There's the loss of pregnancy. So why don't we just take a moment? I want you to call to mind some of those losses as you are able. If it's something that's too hard, it's okay. So call to mind those things for a moment. You can close your eyes if you need to. The word comfort, it doesn't mean that things are tied up nicely in a bow. When we experience comfort in our loss, it doesn't mean that there's a perfectly silver lining bow around it. If anybody wants to share some of the losses that you've had, I'd love to hear it. If you want to, you're welcome to speak it out if you want.
The loss of a good friend.
Yeah.
The loss of the moral, or ethic, like we were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
The death of a sibling.
Loss of safety.
Take care.
The loss of my 20-year-old self that could run circles around my 60-year-old self.
Oh man, that's so true.
Someone said death of parents, miscarriages, 6 miscarriages in the past 2 years.
Thanks for that.
Lost good friends from Corona,
Yeah.
and a cousin.
Yeah. This world has been soaked in loss in many ways. When Jason and I found out that we couldn't have kids, naturally we felt like we were just called to adopt. And a lot of you know my story in a lot of ways, but we went through the whole adoption process and on this like database, this list to be picked, and we were picked, and we were picked for this little boy who was being born at that very moment in the hospital. And so we scrambled to get everything that we would need in order to be this kid's parents, and we went and picked up this little boy named Matthew when he was 2 days old, and he was just the sweetest thing in the world. And then we found out that his dad really wanted to be his son's dad, and he was going to fight us for the rights of this child, which I guess is fairly common, and it usually dies down, but this guy was not going to die down. He wanted so badly to be his son's dad. And so after a month of having our first kid ever, and also knowing so many other adoptive parents who were on database lists for 5-10 years, hoping to God that a birth mom would pick them, we felt like we needed to stop the adoption process so this boy could go back with his dad. And it was the most horrific experience ever, because we really didn't think that we would ever be picked again. It was incredible loss of our first kid. And it's a loss that continues forth in many ways, the losses that we have in our lives. We don't just get over them. We don't heal quickly. It doesn't mean that healing doesn't happen, but those things stay embedded in our lives, in our very marrow, in the bones of us. We feel those things. And in my experience of dealing with loss and talking with people and just being a pastor, I've noticed that people tend to approach loss or death in 2 different ways. And there's a bunch of different ways. I don't want to pigeonhole anybody here. But some of us have this hope that we're going to rise above the pain and make it through. We have this idea of like, I'm not the kind of person who needs to suffer. Like, I'm with Jesus, and so I shouldn't feel any of this pain right now, and so I'm going to rise above it. We have this Christian community sort of a way that doesn't quite allow for lament and faith to exist in honesty. And so we say things in our worship spaces like, God is good all the time God is good. And while that's true, life still sucks sometimes, and it's hard. So we create these false narratives of happiness, like everything is fine. We don't want to be a burden on anybody as well. So we want to hold it close to ourselves. So there's different ways that we avoid through self-medicating, through alcohol or food, or through drugs, or through sex, or other kinds of compulsions trying to fill whatever it is that we're experiencing. And another response that people tend to have is that they tend to wallow or despair in their loss. Loss begins to define everything that we do, and every part of life then starts to feel hopeless. It's like everything that we do, everything that we see is defined through this pain we are experiencing, the suffering, whatever it is that's happening in our lives. And so life is seen through this lens of our own suffering, and everything is affected by it in sometimes a very hopeless way. The thing about Jesus saying that those who are mourning are blessed is very counterintuitive, because mourning isn't simply feeling sad or rising above the pain or numbing it out. Mourning is deeply engaging in the pain of that loss without allowing that loss to define you as a person. Pain is deeply engaging with that loss without allowing that loss to define you as a person. It means letting go of what looks proper, what is expected of you. It's feeling everything that you're needing to feel. And the loss will even shape the story of who you are, but your loss is not meant to be your story. That's not the end of who you are. So I'm going to look at two different stories today that I feel encompass this beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The first is from the Old Testament book of Ruth. There's Bibles around. If you need a Bible, there's a few just around, so grab one. Will it be up on the screen? I forgot to
Yeah, what passage is it?
Ruth 1. We'll look at the entire chapter 1 of Ruth. And it'll also be on the screen. Any thoughts before we move on to Ruth? Anything coming up? Anything that you feel I'm missing or need more texture to? Yeah, so Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel comes next, 1st and 2nd Kings. I feel like, so I grew up in a very Christian home in Sunday school and everything. We did these things called sword drills. Do y'all remember that? Where like somebody would shout out a passage of scripture and you'd have to like find it as fast as you could, and you stood up in Sunday school and whoever got it first is like obviously more holy than everybody else or something. They love Jesus more. But then some of the kids would have these little tabs on their Bible and they could turn really fast. That was definitely cheating. Anyway, my kids do not know the books of the Bible because they've never been involved in sword drills. And that is great, they don't have that baggage, but it's also terrible because they don't have that baggage. So, that's just what it means to live in tension, isn't it? All right, so the book of Ruth, I'm going to read the entire first chapter. It's on the screen as well, and just allow it to be what it is. It could be very familiar to you, or it might be the first time you're ever hearing this passage. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. And every time I read that, I think, Elimelech, Elimelech, Elimelech. You guys do too? I love you all so much. Okay. This is very serious. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Will you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Thus they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. May the Lord add a blessing to this reading. So we can see just from that very beginning paragraph that Naomi has experienced a tremendous amount of loss in her life. She lost her home and her friends when famine hit and she had to leave her country. She lost her husband when he died. She lost both of her sons when they were still young, before they ever had kids. I know it says that they married these women and they lived there for 10 years, but I have to guess, since no one had children, they probably lived there for 10 years, married these women, and then died. And then she decided to go back to her homeland, which was all she knew before then. And I think of that sense of her, like going back to her homeland. I know that for myself, when I am experiencing an amount of loss in my life, I almost crave going back to my childhood home. I have good memories there, not everybody does. But there's this sense of like feeling like you belong somewhere when something has been removed from your life. And I can see her wanting to do that. And Naomi's not alone. She has Ruth, but she feels totally alone. She feels absolutely abandoned, and she feels hopeless. And every part of her life is defined by loss. And Naomi has ventured beyond mourning and into becoming renamed and redefined by her loss. She asks her friends and her relatives to call her Mara, which means bitter, because that's who she sees herself to be. She wants to be known by what she feels fully within herself. And the story goes on with like Ruth caring for Naomi and gleaning these fields where the barley grows, and just enough to bring home to make some bread and keep surviving. And while Ruth is collecting what the harvesters had left behind, she catches the eye of the field owner named Boaz. And he's totally intrigued by her, and he provides her protection and like this care for her while she's there. It was very vulnerable to be a woman back then, vulnerable to be a woman still today, but back then you could easily be taken advantage of by the men in the fields, especially if there were places that they could take women and not be seen. And so he wanted to provide her with all the protection possible. So Ruth goes home after this day of working in this field. She goes home to Naomi at the end of the day with 30 pounds of barley flour that she had collected and then milled. And Naomi explains about this guy named Boaz. that owns this field. He is somebody called a kinsman redeemer, meaning that he's a person who is obligated to certain relatives in times of their great loss or a space of great need. It's his obligation to step into those spaces. And so the story continues on in this book of Ruth. It showcases Ruth and this budding relationship with Boaz, like this love story, where Naomi seems to play like a matchmaker in the background. And being raised in a very Christian home, I love playing with Barbies, but my Barbies always had like these biblical things going on. I'm like, Boaz, Ruth, oh hey! We didn't have a TV, okay, you guys? It was the whole thing. Oh my goodness. Anyway, so Naomi's this matchmaker. She wasn't even involved in this story with the Barbies. But it's like Naomi, who is this woman who is defined by bitterness and hopelessness. She begins to forget that new name of Mara. She grabs a hold of a different purpose. And in that place of purpose, that old sense of knowing herself starts to kind of disintegrate a little bit around her. Like her focus shifted off of her loss and onto a new sense of purpose and potential of how her life could be. And instead of mourning and grief being her story, it shifts to become part of her story when her focus is disrupted through hope. And what seemed utterly hopeless for her, she now had this new potential for hope. And God's comfort to Naomi came through Naomi's purpose. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. The book of Ruth is named Ruth, but really it's a story about Naomi in many ways. She's not some side character. She is the main character in the story. Turn with me to the end of Ruth if you're still there. If it's too hard to find, no worries. We'll be in Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, because it ends here with this. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May this child become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. You notice how like Ruth kind of just fades right out of the picture? It's just like, now she's gone. Naomi has a son. I don't know what happened. We don't know if like maybe Ruth died in childbirth. The Bible doesn't tell us that. I don't think it's necessarily important for us to know exactly what was happening, but the Bible says that Naomi took the child and cared for him. This was a new life of purpose that provided comfort in the midst of mourning. This new life whose story gave birth to Jesse's story, who gave birth to David's story, King David's story, who eventually gave birth to Joseph's story, who gave birth through adoption to Jesus' story. And we then mirror the story of Christ because we have been given birth through adoption into the story of Christ, who is hope beyond hope beyond hope. I mean, how incredible is that? This story that seems like it would never be able to get past loss became part of our story that brought us here to this room today. That is wild. That is crazy. Because isn't that just the truth? That like, how fortunate are those who sit deep into the overwhelming grief of loss because they know that that loss isn't the end of their story. The hope of Jesus Christ, it's life that doesn't end after our last breath on earth. The hope of Jesus Christ is eternal. It is everlasting. And it goes with us into heaven after death, where every tear will be wiped from our eyes. Where the earthly loss, with every gut-wrenching death, the morning comes with comfort, because in the end it is well with our souls. It is well with our souls. There was a prominent lawyer in Chicago in 1860. His name was Horatio Spafford, and he was someone who loved God. He was a faithful Presbyterian churchgoer. His best friend was D.L. Moody, who was like this really famous evangelist and missionary. Horatio had a great family. He loved his wife, he loved his kids, and just wanted to give everything to them. During the 1860s, he purchased this huge amount of property in Chicago, and put all of his investments into this property, and saw it being something that could help his family and help the kingdom of God. And just shortly thereafter, the Great Chicago Fire happened, and all of his investments were burnt away. So he experienced that first loss of just financial well-being. About 2 years later, his 4-year-old son died of scarlet fever, and that affected his family incredibly. A couple years after that, he had kind of gained back some of his financial resources, and he was able to save up enough with his family to go to vacation to Europe. And his friend D.L. Moody would be in Europe doing some evangelism stuff, and so he was like, let's just go and do this, it's gonna be great, our family really needs the rest. But he was held up on business in Chicago, so he sent his family on ahead of him, his wife and his 4 daughters. They were ages 2 to 11. It was Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta. Every time. And they were traveling on a steamship across the Atlantic Ocean, and another iron-built ship came across and ran into them accidentally and sunk them. Over 200 passengers died, including all 4 of Horatio's daughters. And when his wife arrived in Europe, she sent him a telegram that only said, "Saved alone." So Horatio, obviously in so much grief, he set sail immediately for Europe to be with his wife, who probably experienced amazing loss by seeing her children die in front of her. And in his mourning, in his devastating grief and total lack of control, while crossing the exact location of his daughter's death, he grabs a piece of paper and a pen, and he starts to pen these words that had been swimming in his head. And in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in the graveyard of his grief, he writes, "When peace like a river attended my way." I know Linda. I know you, girl. "When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Those words became an anthem of Christ's hope to Horatio and countless others, including myself. Every time I've sung this song, it has been absolutely intense. Thanks, Tammy. And I have felt
Can you read that again?
time, what's that, honey?
Can you read those words again?
Yeah. "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." And I think that a lot of us know what it feels like to feel like you're going under, right? Those sea billows are just rolling over you. And even in those spaces, for myself, I know that Jesus has taught me to say, it is well with my soul. And in this incredible loss that Horatio experienced and lived through, it wasn't his story, but it certainly shaped his story. Anna and Horatio had 3 more kids. One that died when he was 3 years old of scarlet fever again. He and his wife, they just could not go back to church as usual. They could not do the whole religious thing like they had always seen and experienced. They just couldn't do it. And so they left their church, and then they started a house church called the Overcomers. And then they traveled to different parts of the world, and they set up soup kitchens and started caring for marginalized and oppressed people who were often overlooked. And they adopted a 16-year-old boy from Jerusalem, and they continued the story of Christ's comforting hope in the midst of great tragedy. The thing is that for us as Americans, we want to make lemonade out of those lemons, don't we? We are so uncomfortable with sadness, with crying, with discomfort, With grief, we are so uncomfortable with any form of discomfort that we try to make things all easy and good. We don't want to seem like a burden to anyone, so we don't want to actually speak out exactly what's happening in our lives. But maybe it's okay to admit that these lemons suck. They're just horrible. There's nothing good to make out of them right now. I can't even squeeze a single drop out because there's nothing good about these lemons. And sometimes there's no silver lining to loss. To hurricanes, to climate change, to your faith unraveling all around you, to the great injustice in this world, to the amount of extreme poverty around us. There's no silver lining to grief because of the sin that you've partaked in, or how sick your kid is right now, or that your favorite person just died. Sometimes it's okay to say there is nothing good to squeeze out of this right now. And the loss that we've all experienced on this side of eternity is true, and it's real, and not one of us is exempt from it. But Jesus invites those who are living through this grief not to stuff it down, or smile through it, or just allow it to change their actual name and say, I don't want to be known as this person anymore because I'm totally changed by this. But to find their home and their hope in God, who provides comfort, and to know their story is defined by hope, even when all we can taste is rotten lemons. Any thoughts? Anything coming up that you want to just express or just be mad at or experience? Yeah, Heather.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for holding the space. It's getting intense feelings. So everyone has at some point.
We all have it. I know.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think it's really been common for me in my life with grief to, when it's really acute, but also later on after processing some of it, it can be really hard to not, or I guess I should say it's really easy to when those big feelings come up, somehow like blame ourselves and
Yes.
blame myself. And I'm picking from this passage that it's kind of saying, sit with that grief and feel those feelings, but don't take that second, don't shoot that second arrow at yourself or making it like your own fault somehow.
Yes.
And or that don't take on the extra guilt, and that's what I'm taking from this. And I just wanted to have any thoughts on how to navigate that, because that seems really hard.
Yeah, that sense of wanting to blame ourselves if we're not getting over what we're experiencing fast enough, or it's still affecting us in ways that we're surprised by. I think it's really important to give yourself and to give other people grace in how they grieve, because not every person grieves the same. Not everybody arrives at the same conclusion right away, and oftentimes it takes a lot of grace, which is sometimes the hardest thing. Yeah, Hollis.
I've heard it said before that with real loss, we don't really get over it. It's more like learning to live without a hand or something.
Yeah.
Like you don't lose, you don't gain what you lost back. You just learn to live without it.
Yeah, I've always seen it as like when you're standing at Moonstone Beach and your feet are in the sand. Loss is like the waves that are like barely touching you. Sometimes you're just like, you almost forget that it's there. You get acclimated to the temperature of the water. It's not as harsh on your skin any longer. And it's just like, it's part of you, but you don't even really notice it. But then sometimes there's like a friggin' sneaker wave that comes out of nowhere and like takes you out into the ocean with that loss. And you're like, wait, I thought I was over that. I thought I had already dealt with that. I thought that this wasn't gonna affect me this way. But it just comes up all the time. Like, it might feel simple to some people, but for a long time, it was the hardest thing to go to baby showers. To like see somebody with that nice, beautiful belly and know that that's something that I would never experience. Not to say I didn't want to be invited and I didn't want to be included. It was still hard. And I think it's okay that we can admit those things of like, this is hard, but I still want to be a part of it, even when it's hard. Because it's more worth it to be a part of it than not. Yeah. There's this Jewish practice in the Jewish faith that when people are grieving the loss of a loved one, a family member specifically, that they aren't alone in that grief. This practice is called sitting Shiva. And this grieving community gathers around this family member who has lost somebody in their family, and they sit in silence with them for 7 days. And they sit there in the mourning and in the grief, and they feel it all fully, and they have the food and the coffee continuing to come and just take care of this person. But they aren't there to offer platitudes like everything happens for a reason, or God just wanted another angel, or whatever garbage that we say when we're trying to figure out how to deal with loss because we're so uncomfortable. They allow the silence to exist. That is so powerful. They're present in those silent spaces of grief, trusting that there's spiritual and emotional healing that's happening in their silence, trusting that God moves in the silence. After we gave Matthew back to the adoption agency, it was December 4th, 2005, we felt totally lost. We felt absolutely undone in our grief. Like we just didn't even know how we were going to function whatsoever. And I went back to work as a server at a restaurant. The restaurant was in a mall, so it was like decorated for Christmas with, I mean, just to the nines. It was a very wealthy mall that had like a Saks Fifth Avenue in it and stuff. And it was very nice there. And it was hard to go there, and everybody's rejoicing, everybody's happy, and no one knew that, like, the suffering I was feeling deep in my body. And then every night we would drive home. I would drive home to this little house in Newport, and it was so dark, and it was so cold, and it was so empty in that space. And I didn't know how to decorate for Christmas. I didn't know how to move into those spaces. I didn't think I could at all. It was too hard to even put up anything. Everybody else's houses looked great. Ours was very dark and cold. And my younger sister was working at Starbucks, and she lived nearby at the time. And she had saved up a little bit of money, and she went to Target. And she bought us lights and garlands and stockings and this wooden decoration that says peace on it that we still have. We put it up every year. And she decorated our dark and empty home for us. In the midst of our great mourning and our grief, in the midst of what we were experiencing, we were so comforted by her love. And it wasn't like this clear purpose that brought us through, like Naomi had with Ruth. Like it wasn't that brought us through. It wasn't starting a church or writing some sort of a song that became really important. That wasn't what brought us through either. It was the body of Christ. With my sister and with my small group, that God had motivated to bring us comfort through them. And because of that, because of them stepping into spaces that we could not do for ourselves, that I couldn't even verbalize. Like, you know what that people say, like, well, how can I help you? And I'd be like, oh, can you decorate my house for Christmas? I would have never been able to say that or verbalize it or even say, I don't want to be a burden to anybody. She stepped in, they stepped in and provided us comfort, almost making us feel like we were embraced by God because of their embrace for us. In the Message version, I'm going to end on this. Eugene Peterson writes of this beatitude, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. He says, you are blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. Let's sit in the silence for a moment, take a few deep breaths. I know this is dredging up all sorts of things. We'll take a moment to process, and then we'll go into our time of response to the communion. Coming up before we go into our time of response today? Yeah, Jeff.
I was wondering what is the invitation to those who aren't mourning to those who are?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not saying you have to answer it,
No,
just a question.
I think we can all grow in our empathy as people, but yeah, just that sense of sitting Shiva. It doesn't mean you're moving into somebody's house and moving into their spaces, but she's just being that silent support is absolutely incredible. Yeah.
I think it would be really powerful if we could all sing that.
Okay. Are we gonna sing it? No, let's sing it then.
We can sing it on
Yeah.
Yeah, you wanna lead us?
Sure.
When
Like a river,